So before I introduce Manish and Madhura, I'm just going to sort of frame the session a little bit. So um, we are in the midst of the biggest remote working experiment in history, and that there probably ever will be, I suspect. At least I hope it's the biggest experiment that ever, forced experiment that there ever will be. And we're seeing some really interesting things happening, I think. We're going to hear about those across the 2 days. And just to put it into context, Michael Arena, who's speaking, I can't remember if it's today or tomorrow. I was in a session that he was running with our Insight 222 group 2 weeks ago. God, it's already 2 weeks ago. And we're getting lots of signals telling us about how people feel more productive at home and everything else. And a lot of that is through self-reported surveys. But actually, when you start to look at the network analytics, you start to understand things that confirm what we're hearing in surveys, but also things that are maybe a little bit different as well. And what we're seeing, again, and I think, Manish, you're going to talk about this a little bit, is that we're collaborating. And again, there was a business review out about this as well. We're seeing that people within teams that you collaborate with frequently, you're actually having closer collaboration with working remotely. But people that you maybe collaborate with less, maybe in another team, you're tending not to have those conversations, that collaboration at the moment. And what the potential that gives for innovation and creativity in the future could be challenging. And it means that people analytics teams are not just understanding what's happening now around productivity, around collaboration, around burnout, and everything else that's been associated with working remotely. They're also understanding of what this might look like in the future. What is the mix between working remotely in a virtual environment and working together? What are the tasks that we might want to do together versus what are the tasks that we can maybe do more productively independently? And what we're seeing, and Madhura Chakrabarti, who's the global head of people insights and analytics at Syngenta, and previously, prior to that, actually was a researcher and analyst in this space for Burson by Deloitte, so she knows this space particularly well. And you're also an IF psychologist as well, Madhura, I think I'm right in saying as well. So lots of strings to your bow. And Manish Goel is the CEO of TrustSphere. They're here to discuss some of these initial findings that we've seen around, what has this big shift to remote working meant, and particularly what they're seeing around the differences of impact across network structures and maybe the disproportionate impact on certain groups as well. They're going to share some of these initial insights, and then we're going to come together for a broader conversation afterwards. So Manish and Madhura, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much. Just very quickly, there's been a lot of, obviously, over the last number of months, we've gone through the biggest change in our working environment that I think most of us have ever experienced. And I think that's raised a lot of questions with our clients to understand what does that mean for the long-term impact of work, and what does it mean for the future of work. And we at TrustSphere, what we're doing is we're looking specifically at utilizing ONA, or organizational network analytics, understanding communication flows that exist, the digital communication flows that exist in an organization, to understand what that means and how that can start to inform a number of the decisions that organizations are having to make around this space. The first thing I'd love to say is that changes in activity. And there's been a lot of work and a lot of questions around productivity and people's changes in productivity. The first thing we would say is changes in activity levels alone don't tell the full story. And we've been working with some clients, and there's a client that we worked with where specifically they looked at two different groups, and they were looking at the changes in activity that occurred with those groups. And what they were asking, does this actually improve, or does this change? How does this help us understand how work is occurring? We looked at activity levels. You can see in these two groups, they're about the same level of change, both pre and post lockdown. But when we look at the relationship networks themselves change quite significantly. And it's in the changes in the relationship networks where you start to get a lot of really interesting insights. First one you can start to see in Group A there has increased their activity levels, or the relationship network levels, by about 95%, versus Group B, where there was only an increase of 40%. The big difference between these two groups has specifically been around cross-functional relationships. So Group A increased their cross-functional relationships significantly, while Group B actually decreased cross-functional relationships. And then what we're also finding with our clients is the networks are evolving really rapidly, and that has implications for the underlying collaboration patterns and the structures that exist. It's those dynamics. If you see this group, we're working with a client here to try to understand the impact on both different groups and on different people within those groups. You can see the group here, the blue group has moved into a much more intermediary role. And the question that the client's asking at this point is, why is that? Why has that occurred? Has it occurred because they've fundamentally changed their behaviors, or is it a response to the rest of the organization and the way that they've changed their activity levels? You can see between the pre and post, the activity levels increased significantly, and the number of ties and the number of relationships increased significantly. And also a number of the influences, as well as a number of the groups have changed in terms of positioning that they have. Madhura, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So hi everyone. So following up to what Manish said, we were interested to look at, does remote work, the 3 months or 4 months where we all went remote, does that really impact certain functions or certain roles differentially than others? And what we found was, if we go to the next slide, there are clearly some functions that were much less impacted by the remote work. And you can see the set of functions in the middle that are outlined by a dotted line. When you look at their activity change or relationship change compared to the pre-COVID days, when the normal was to come into work, and the during COVID days when everybody was under lockdown and was working from home, certain functions did not go through any change, or minimal change rather. And then there are some functions at the top and some functions at the bottom on the chart where activity levels and relationship levels significantly increased. In some cases, both of them increased. In some cases, both of them decreased. And in a few of them, one increased and the other one decreased. But the key takeaway here is remote work doesn't impact all functions equally. Clearly, some are more impacted by the other than the others. But what also, or how we are planning to use this data is, as we think about return to work, or who should come to work, or whom should we open up the facilities for, this is one data point that we are likely to use, say, in order to figure out who should be back and who can still continue for a longer period of time. Because for a lot of facilities or a lot of sites, we still cannot open it up to the entire population. So that's one way we are trying to think about it. But also when we talk about what does the new normal, or what does the future look like in terms of a post-COVID world, we will potentially consider some of these functions as more conducive to remote work or a hybrid model than others. Now, we clearly don't know why certain functions had significant increase in activity or relationship change, or a significant decrease, but clearly the data is saying that there was an increase or a decrease, right? And that's what's important to know. And like I said, this is one data point. We are likely to add more survey data or other data in order to understand what exactly is going on behind it. That's about it. Yeah, so the next one, and I can continue here, is we also wanted to look at how are certain demographics, not just functions, but if you look at tenure and generation and gender, what are we seeing? What patterns are we seeing in collaboration when we compare the pre-lockdown and the during lockdown? And I personally think this was the most interesting finding out of the study that we did, was if you think about their external orientation, and when I say external, it doesn't mean external to the company, it just means external to that demographic category. So on the x-axis, you see the different demographic categories. Think of it as tenure, gender, generation, whether you're a line manager or not. So different groups that you may belong to. And on the y-axis is external orientation, the extent to which you actually collaborate or network with people outside of your particular group. So if I'm Gen Y, the extent to which I'm collaborating with Gen X or Gen Z or baby boomers will make me more externally oriented. So what this shows us is when we compare the two environments, the face-to-face versus remote, or pre-lockdown and during lockdown, people in the same demographic category start collaborating and networking with those who are in the same category in the remote environment. And what it really means is think about the longer term impact on inclusion. And if we really leave remote work or working from home to itself without any specific intervention or any deliberate mechanisms for people to connect, there might be a red flag in terms of DNI, because as we see, people tend to start connecting more with people who are like themselves. So again, back to how we are going to use the data as we think about the future, as we think about how we want to reshape our new ways of working. This is something that we will deliberately think about, that when we offer, or if and when we offer a hybrid model or remote working model to employees, we have to put in place some deliberate mechanisms through which people can connect, almost like nudging people or forcing people to connect with people who are not like themselves. And that's the main takeaway from here.
And just to add to that, Madhura, thank you. And just to add to that, I mean, that's consistent with what we're finding across our clients. People are gravitating and starting to work with people like themselves. And in that sense, it also indicates that levels of networks are starting to narrow. For individuals, their networks are starting to narrow, and they tend to work either within their own team, they work within their own, as Madhura was saying, within their own function, within their own team, or with people who have similar attributes to them. And one area that we'd like to highlight is what the implications are for gender DEI in particular. And what we're finding is this actually provides a possible amplification of existing structural barriers, which really has implications for long-term opportunity structures. And let me explain this chart briefly. What we're seeing here is we're seeing males and females. And we're seeing on the top here different levels. So levels 1 to 4, level 1 being most senior, 4 being most junior, replicated here. What we're measuring here is the number of relationships that each individual subgroup within these two groups has with one another. And what we've done is we've looked specifically at the change in the number of relationships that between pre and post lockdown. So what's been the change in the network structure between pre and post lockdown? It's a little bit of an eye chart, but let me show you a couple of findings in this that are quite interesting. First one, if you look at junior staff in particular, what you're going to see is that there is, if you look at activity levels between males and females were about the same. However, if you look at the network and the impact of the network between males and females, at the junior levels, it was markedly different. If you see here with males, there's a number of blue. With females, it's all particularly red, all fairly red. And in particular, we're seeing big decreases at the peer level within female level 3s. So again, if you think about what that means from a longer term perspective, there is an erosion of the networks, and there are potential erosion of networks, and there is a contraction or a narrowing of the networks that we're observing in this particular client. If you take a look at the level 2s, and the level 2s are an interesting group. For this particular client, this was the pivotal group before people were promoted into managerial levels. And so at the end of the day, this was a very important, it was an important part of the overall pipeline for that managerial pipeline. Here you can see in the male level 2s, predominantly blue, so they were all increasing their relationship networks, across the board. Females, on the other hand, not so. So you're seeing that actually females, in particular, the upper hierarchy relationships or peer relationships, were actually contracting. The way that the client interpreted this was actually it starts to identify the constraint, if you will, of what McKinsey calls the broken rung. This is the in terms of the opportunity ladder or the opportunity structures for career advancement. It's where we're starting to see levels of change or disconnect between career advancement opportunities and the networks and the relationship networks and the network structures that give rise to those opportunity structures. And what this has is longer term implications for the talent pipeline as a whole, particularly if you look at the junior females where they're not building the relationships or their network, so narrowing versus their male colleagues. This is where you're going to start to see in the longer run a potential disconnect or a deviation between male promotability and female promotability in the long run. Madhura, back to you.
Thank you. So finally, this is the last section for this presentation. We were interested to look at influencers, so people who are mostly connected with others, and what does that look like? Not in terms so much as, who are the influencers or, the top 10 names or top 15 names, but more around what do the profiles look like? And are there any new influencers emerging in the remote work environment? And we had some interesting set of findings here as well. So if you go to the next slide, on the left-hand side, again, we are still working through the findings and what it means and the solutioning of it. So I couldn't really share the actual data. We are yet to get permission to share all of that. But at a high level, what we saw in the data was those who emerged as influencers overall. So no matter whether it's in the face-to-face or the remote work environment, they tended to be more tenured, higher or senior executives, and mostly males than females. But then we also looked at those influencers who emerged as influencers only in the remote environment. So they were not influencers in the pre-COVID face-to-face environment. And we are gradually starting to see a diversification of the profile. And what that means is we're seeing more number of females emerge as influencers. We are seeing more number of people from lower tenure, so early hires or mid-career level people, than the more tenured employees. So there's quite a lot. It's still very early. We are not seeing it across all demographics that we would love to see, but we are definitely seeing it in one or two of them, and pretty significantly. And as Michael Arena was talking about the same phenomenon in the Insight 222 talk, and he said something similar, that one of the hypotheses for remote working is this digital environment is probably becoming a more level playing field. And that's what we are seeing in our data as well, in the diversification of the profile. Now, what we also did was we had simultaneous surveys, like many organizations are doing, around COVID and how we are coping with it and how energized we feel with work. And we correlated that data with the influencer or ONA data. And what we found was, overall, if we look at the influencers who were influencers in both the environments, remote and face-to-face, they are people who find their work meaningful, they're super energized by it, they are able to maintain a good work-life balance. They also indicated that remote work is a unique situation for them, meaning that they're probably people who come into work or have come into work historically. So these are some of the things where they're way off the charts compared to the company average. But then we looked at just the influencers who emerged as influencers in the remote environment, and we see a significant difference in terms of they report much higher workload. They also report lower balance between work and relaxation, relatively low scores on energized by work. So what that means is there probably is a cost to the emerging influencers or becoming a digital influencer, and there is a potential risk of burnout in becoming one. But on one hand, it's great that we are seeing the diversification. On the other hand, we are also seeing signs of potential burnout. And if organizations can help, or if HR or any part of the organization can step in, this is where we need to be proactive into how can we promote more digital mental well-being and help these influencers manage the workload or manage their work or ways of working in the new environment. We still, like I said, we still haven't solution for it. We don't know what exactly it would mean, but we are definitely starting to see these trends. Over to you, Manish.
Yeah, thank you, Madhura. And look, I mean, just to add to what Madhura was saying, I mean, what we found in, this is another client, we found exactly a similar, a very similar sort of situation, where the influencers, they provided a degree of resilience during the crisis. These were the knowledge brokers in this particular organization. If you look at it, their networks increased at 2.5 times the rate of the general population. They also had greater breadth, strength, and diversity of their networks, but it wasn't uniform. And what we also found was some of their influencers had stronger cross-functional relationships, whilst others had stronger internal relationships. So providing resilience in different ways. And the question really gets asked: why is this happening? But consistent with what you were seeing in your survey data, what we found was that being a knowledge broker or being an influencer comes at a cost, and that cost is really around increased risk of burnout or collaborative overload. And that's, it's a big issue. And what we're finding is that, in terms of being uniform, the changes in relationships aren't uniform across the board. I think they provide the relationship networks. For some, it's actually democratizing. For others, it's actually inhibiting. And I think that this is where there's a degree of nuance that we need to think about as we're trying to understand what the longer term implications are for the collaborative networks and the collaboration and the relationship capital that organizations have built, really to support collaboration, to support innovation, to support inclusiveness, and in particular promotability of talent. On that, David, I'm going to hand it back to you if we have time for questions.
We have time for one question, and I'm going to try and ask a question because I'm seeing more and more organizations now looking at using network analysis, looking at that passive data signal, and as you said, Madhura, let's bring that together with some of the survey data and some of what the other data is telling us as well. The big blocker I see for many organizations, though, is where to get started. So there's two areas around that, I think, that would be great if you could both talk to. One is around where should I get started? And number two, the constant thing I hear from, well, not constant, I hear most from people coming in, particularly those from companies based in Europe, is how do I have these discussions with my privacy teams and works councils about using this passive data? So, Madhura, you might be able to talk specifically to Syngenta, and Manish, I know you could probably talk to several organizations that you've been working with. So maybe, Madhura, you go first.
Sure. So I think two things. One is, I think a table stake is having a business sponsor. But in order to have a business sponsor, what underlies that is having a business reason or a set of questions that need to be answered. The goal cannot be, let's try ONA. And trust me, we had tried that and all of those attempts failed. But every time we had a concrete business question that came to us, and we proposed that ONA could be a really legitimate way to look at it, in addition to survey or focus groups or crowdsourcing that we were planning to do anyway. Those were the instances where we got much more lukewarm response. So the first thing where to start is literally, what is the question that you're trying to answer? And the question cannot be as vague as, let's try to understand more things about remote work. It has to have a hypothesis. It has to be very, very concrete. So we had a condition 1 and a condition 2, and we wanted to see, did collaboration increase when you compare 1 with 2? And we had many such hypotheses after that as well. So questions number 1 for sure. And in terms of GDPR or privacy, I think anytime you have a business sponsor and a set of business questions, then you end up satisfying the legitimate business interest condition in GDPR. And then it's a constant conversation with your GDPR team as to what exactly the analysis are you going to run, what data are you going to use. So for example, for the influencer analysis, we had a lot of detailed conversations with our chief data privacy officer, and they had quite a few restrictions on us as to how we could use the data, and we had to abide by them. We never got around to getting influencer scores. We just knew if somebody was an influencer or not. And then the other thing we also saw was, we had to limit the top influencers to a certain number so that it doesn't show as, there were 50% of the people were influencers or 50% were not. So we could only look at the top whatever X% of the influencers. So the point being, they had very specific recommendations around the influencer analysis, which we had to analyze or which we had to abide by. So it's a constant conversation after you have the set of business questions in mind as to what we can do. Sorry, Manish, go ahead if you have anything else to add.
No,
Manish,
I think you said it.
You have about 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
Exactly what Madhura said. But the two other things I would add is for organizations who are looking at doing this, one, be deliberate about the question that you're looking to answer. You need the business sponsor, but you need to have a deliberate hypothesis or a question that O&A can answer. The second thing is use the data for good. At the end of the day, the ethics around using this data will help you not just with your staff, but also with your compliance teams and for the organization as a whole. And I think the theme of this particular conference is around data for good. I think we as people analytics practitioners and data providers need to live by that particular ethos as well.
Manish, Madhura, it's always a delight to hear from you and see some of the great work that you're both doing. So thank you very much for joining us.